So today I wanted to talk to you about Nicole Chung's memoir, All You Can Ever Know. And in this book, she talks about her personal experience of being a transracial adoptee to a white adoptive family that lives in a small white town in southern Oregon. And she was originally born in Seattle, Washington in 1981, the year that her adoption took place. And so what's interesting about her story is that, she is Korean American, but her adoption took place within the United States. Her birth family was already in the United States. And so when we think about, Korean adoptees, usually we think about that as an international adoption, but this was a domestic adoption. The family did not originally seek out to adopt a child from Korea or China or anything like that, but this was a domestic adoption, but transracial. And this was quite traumatic for her because within the family, they adopted and approached their family through a colorblind ideology. But what we want to do is kind of take a step back and look at the sociological framework and the power and institutions that are behind her narrative. And she alludes to these, structures and power dynamics behind her own personal story. She opens with discussing in the first chapter the traditional adoption narrative, and that's the narrative that comes from her birth parents and how they came to a place to adopt her. And it's one in which the story of the adoptive family is empowered over the story of the birth family. And it's one that's almost magical or mystical or religious, in that this was a predetermined event, something that was made to happen, something that was supposed to be, or something that's really, a good turn of events in the end. And so that this child was supposed to be part of this family. And that's what her family really stressed to her over and over and over again. And so later, as an adult writing this book, she kind of questions this standard narrative. And so what's important is, of course, there's lots of different perspectives and narratives within this very personal situation. This is structured through social institutions, through laws, policies, through power. Who has the power to decide which narratives will be told? So for my students in particular, I want to really focus on some key terms and concepts that you should be able to distinguish when we talk about adoption. And so those include the differences between the categories of adoption. You have domestic adoption, foster adoption, international adoption, you have transracial adoption, closed and open adoptions, and then also I put in the concept of culturally competent therapy. So when we think about adoption, we want to look at how large this issue is in our society. And so I post some statistics for my students where in 2019 there were approximately 424,000 children in foster care in the United States. And about a quarter of those, about 100,000 children, were up for adoption. It's estimated that there's about 1 million children that are living with adoptive parents in the United States, and that international adoptions have been decreasing in numbers overall, and that in 2019 the most popular country of international adoption was China to the United States. The Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoption was adopted on April 1st, 2008, and that regulates the processes and standards of international adoption between the United States and 75 other countries. And so it's really important for us sociologically to understand the international laws that govern international adoption, the domestic laws, the federal and state level laws that frame adoption policies, the narratives that are given as far as how you should integrate this adopted child into your life. Should it be a colorblind ideology? Should it be a culturally competent ideology in which the child gets to be raised with their culture of birth, and so on? In the United States, it's also changed from one policy of closed adoption to a policy of open adoption, where there's more involvement with the birth parents into the lives of the adoptive parents and the adopted child. And so the families can really figure out their level of engagement. And overall, it's shown that more open adoptions have a lot more positive mental health outcomes for all of the parties involved. So, the important thing sociologically for us in this story also is just this issue of transracial adoption and why it is that a lot of white families adopt children from other countries, foster children of color, and then reinforce and raise these children in this white culture where they really act to kind of deny their culture of origin. In Nicole Chung's story, you can really see the thread throughout the entire memoir where her racial identity creates a point of crisis throughout her life. She talks about how, she really noticed that she looked different from her classmates, from her family, and she was told, she suffered from racial slurs from classmates in elementary school, and she was really alienated and pointed out and isolated because of her racial difference. But yet her family gave her this schizophrenic kind of perspective of both, exotifying her as, you're our China doll kind of exotification of the child, and maybe selectively introducing the child to these stereotypical cultural associations, like, a particular type of media or food, go out to the restaurant or this festival and occasion, but otherwise have this colorblind ideology where the child is raised in a white assimilationist fashion where their racial and ethnic background is really denied them and minimized in significance and importance. But the person themselves, and we hear so many Korean adoptees talk about this disconnect between their racial identity and how they were taught to deal with racism, basically, from their white family. And overwhelmingly, they were just not trained to deal with these kinds of racial microaggressions that they would face on a daily basis. Nicole was really affected by this because she talks in one point in the book where, she memorized every single Asian, here she says, "At home, I kept a secret running tally of every single Asian person I had ever seen in public. I was on nodding terms with some of them. The woman at the Minute Mart, the person who owned the Chinese restaurant, the couple who were always behind the counter at the donut den. It was possible to go months, even years, without seeing anyone who was new to me. Walking around Seattle that week, I tried to play my Count the Asian game and lost track every time. Here, finally, I was inconspicuous. Why hadn't my parents raised me in a place like this? The seed of an idea, strange and hopeful, had been planted in my mind. There were real places, not far off in Korea, but here in my own country, where I could be just another face in the crowd." So the question is, these white families who specifically choose to adopt a child from a different country, culture, race, which was not the case in Nicole Chung's story. Why do they want to do that? Bring this child here. Often this child is also raised in a very white town where they really stand out. They stand out in their family portrait. They stand out in their school lineup. And then also to deny this racial difference, to impose this colorblind ideology. We don't see you as a racialized being. You're just like us. You're white like us. But in fact, the child is not white, and so this really causes some mental health anguish. And so a lot of Korean adoptees later in life, and when they're dealing with their adoption story, seek out therapy. But the field of psychology is incredibly white. If you look at the faculty who teach the courses, if you look at the courses that are offered, rarely are there intercultural classes within the field of psychology. If you look at practitioners, it's really difficult to find someone who isn't white. And so for a lot of people of color, they really seek out a therapist from their own cultural and racial background so that that person can have some kind of framework to understand where they're coming from. And so for Korean adoptees in particular, they might seek out a therapist who deals with adoption, for example. Perhaps plenty of therapists focus on, family therapy, adoption, but who focuses on transracial adoption? And furthermore, how many practitioners are there that are actually Korean adoptees themselves who can really understand the Korean adoptee experience and provide useful advice? And so that's another challenge that Korean adoptees face that is structural in nature. The field of psychology and therapy is not diverse enough, not culturally competent enough to deal with these intercultural issues that come up in cases like international adoption, transracial adoption, and foster care. For my students in particular, I just want you to be able to, read personal memoirs of interesting perspectives, but really to step back and to reflect on the sociological framework that empowers certain stories over the other. Usually the adoptive family is more empowered in this process than the birth family. What narratives do we find acceptable for adoption? Is it acceptable that people without the financial resources, without further material resources, are in a position where they feel like they have to give up their birth child? And is it okay for people just because they have more money to adopt someone else's child? So we want to just understand the power, the social structures, the laws and policies that govern this. And so that's the challenge of applying a sociological analysis to a personal memoir such as Nicole Chung's All You Can Ever Know.